You wake up every morning to an alarm clock that signals the beginning of another day, selling your life by the hour to someone who profits from your labor, while you barely make enough to pay for the basic necessities of existence. You tell yourself this is temporary, that you're building towards something better, that hard work will eventually pay off. But what if I told you that this isn't a temporary condition you can work your way out of? It's a permanent trap the system needs you to stay in. What if your entire relationship to work, your belief that employment equals dignity, your assumption that productivity defines human worth, is the most successful psychological operation in human history? Kathi Weeks, the brilliant feminist theorist who has dissected the ideology of work like no one before her, reveals a truth so threatening to the established order that it's been almost completely suppressed from public discourse. You don't work because work is natural or necessary. You work because you've been ideologically programmed to believe that your survival and worth as a human being depend on your willingness to sell your life to the highest bidder. The system doesn't just need your labor, it needs your belief that work is the only path to a meaningful life. Kathi Weeks understands something that explodes every comfortable assumption about employment and human dignity. The work ethic isn't a natural human inclination toward productivity. It's a form of social control that transforms biological survival needs into moral imperatives that serve capitalist accumulation. You don't work because you love work. You work because you've been taught that not working makes you worthless as a human being. The work ethic operates by making employment appear to be the source of personal fulfillment, social contribution, and moral worth, when actually it's the mechanism through which your life energy is extracted for someone else's profit. You're taught to find your identity in your job title, to measure your success by your productivity, to feel guilty for any time spent not generating economic value. Work becomes not just what you do, but who you are. This ideological programming runs so deep that most people can't imagine human life without wage labor. Even though wage labor has only existed for a few hundred years and has never been the primary way humans organized productive activity throughout most of human history. The idea that everyone must work for wages to earn the right to exist is a recent historical invention, not a natural law. Weeks shows how the work ethic serves capitalism by ensuring that people will voluntarily submit to exploitation rather than being forced into it. When you believe that work is inherently valuable and that your worth as a person depends on your employment status, you become invested in maintaining a system that extracts value from your labor while giving you back just enough to survive and reproduce the next generation of workers. The genius of this system is that it makes you grateful for your exploitation. You thank your employer for the opportunity to make them wealthy. You compete with other workers for the privilege of being exploited. You define your success by how well you serve the interests of people who profit from your labor. You become psychologically dependent on the very relationship that subordinates you. Weeks reveals how the concept of the family wage, the idea that employment should provide enough income to support a nuclear family, functions as a form of ideological control that reinforces both capitalist and patriarchal structures simultaneously. The family wage isn't just about economics. It's about organizing society around specific forms of social reproduction that serve capital accumulation. The family wage ideology assumes that productive labor, paid work, and reproductive labor, childcare, housework, emotional care, should be separated, with men performing productive labor in the public sphere and women performing reproductive labor in the private sphere. This division serves capitalism by ensuring that the essential work of caring for workers and producing the next generation of workers gets done for free, subsidizing capitalist profits through unpaid domestic labor. But Weeks shows how this ideology has evolved to accommodate changing economic conditions while maintaining its essential function. When economic necessity forces both partners in heterosexual couples to work for wages, the ideal becomes the dual-career family, where both partners balance paid work with unpaid domestic responsibilities, typically with women bearing a disproportionate share of the domestic burden. The family wage ideology also functions to discipline workers by making them responsible not just for their own survival, but for the survival of dependents. When you have a family to support, you become less likely to resist exploitative working conditions, more willing to accept inadequate wages, more invested in maintaining employment regardless of how degrading or meaningless that employment might be. Even when the economic reality of the family wage disappears, when single incomes can no longer support families, when benefits and job security evaporate, the ideology persists, creating anxiety and guilt among people who can't achieve the standard that the ideology sets. You blame yourself for not being able to provide adequately for your family, rather than questioning an economic system that makes adequate provision impossible for most people. Perhaps Weeks's most radical insight is her argument for the refusal of work. Not just individual decisions to quit particular jobs, but collective resistance to the entire ideology that makes wage labor appear necessary and desirable. The refusal of work means refusing to accept that human worth should be measured by productivity, that survival should depend on employment, that life should be organized around the demands of capitalist accumulation. This doesn't mean refusing all forms of productive activity or advocating for laziness. It means refusing the specific social relations of wage labor that subordinate human needs to profit requirements. It means insisting that people should have access to the necessities of life regardless of their employment status. It means demanding that productive activity should serve human flourishing rather than capital accumulation. Weeks shows how the refusal of work has always existed as an undercurrent of resistance within capitalist societies, from the early factory workers who had to be violently disciplined into industrial time rhythms, to contemporary movements for shorter working hours, universal basic income, and job guarantees. These movements represent not just demands for better working conditions, but challenges to the fundamental assumption that work should dominate human life. The refusal of work also means questioning what counts as work in the first place. The activities that capitalism doesn't recognize as work, childcare, elder care, emotional support, community building, artistic creation, environmental stewardship, are often the activities that make life meaningful and sustainable. The refusal of work includes insisting that these activities have value independent of their market price. But Weeks emphasizes that the refusal of work can't be purely individual because the structures that compel work are social and political. Individual refusal without collective organization just leads to individual poverty and social isolation. The refusal of work requires collective movements that can create alternative systems of meeting human needs outside of wage labor relations. One of Weeks's most important contributions is her analysis of how capitalism colonizes time itself, transforming temporal experience in ways that serve accumulation rather than human flourishing. Under capitalism, time becomes a commodity that workers sell and employers purchase. But this commodification of time has profound effects on how people experience their lives and relationships. Work time isn't just the hours you spend at your job, it's the entire temporal structure of your life. You wake up when work demands it, sleep when work allows it, organize your relationships around work schedules, plan your activities around work requirements. Even your free time is structured by its relationship to work time. It's time for rest and recreation that prepares you to return to work. This temporal colonization extends beyond individual experience to social organization. Schools train children to accept institutional time rhythms that prepare them for future employment. Social services operate according to work schedules that assume full-time employment is normal and desirable. Urban infrastructure is designed around commuting patterns that serve work requirements rather than community needs. Weeks shows how the politics of time are central to any challenge to work-centered society. Movements for shorter working hours aren't just about getting more time off. They're about asserting human control over temporal experience rather than allowing that experience to be dictated by profit requirements. The demand for time is the demand for life itself. But she also reveals how capitalism responds to demands for time by intensifying the time that remains. When working hours are reduced, productivity requirements increase. When vacation time is mandated, work becomes more stressful. When technology promises to reduce labor time, it actually extends work into previously non-work spaces through constant connectivity and availability. Weeks builds on decades of feminist analysis that reveals how the ideology of work depends on the invisibility and devaluation of reproductive labor. The work of caring for people, maintaining households, and reproducing social relationships. This feminist perspective doesn't just add women's concerns to existing critiques of work. It fundamentally transforms how we understand work itself. Feminist analysis reveals that what capitalism calls work is only a small portion of the labor that actually sustains human life and society. The majority of essential human activities, child care, elder care, food preparation, household maintenance, emotional support, community building, happen outside of wage relations and are therefore invisible to economic analysis that only counts market transactions. This invisibility isn't accidental. It's necessary for capitalist accumulation. If employers had to pay for all the labor that goes into producing and maintaining workers, not just their time on the job, but all the care work that keeps them healthy, housed, fed, emotionally stable, and capable of showing up to work, labor costs would increase dramatically. The capitalist economy depends on getting this essential labor for free. Weeks shows how the feminist slogan, "Wages for Housework," wasn't just about compensating women for domestic labor. It was about revealing the economic relationships that are hidden by the ideology of work. When you recognize that capitalism depends on massive amounts of unpaid labor, the idea that people should earn the right to exist through paid employment becomes obviously absurd. The feminist critique also reveals how the ideology of work intersects with other forms of domination. The assumption that good workers are people without care responsibilities discriminates against women, who still bear primary responsibility for domestic labor. The equation of productivity with human worth devalues the kinds of activities that women have historically performed. The organization of society around paid employment makes it difficult for people to prioritize relationships and care. Weeks identifies a fundamental contradiction in contemporary capitalism. The system needs workers to be produced and maintained through social reproductive labor, but its own logic undermines the conditions that make social reproduction possible. This creates what she calls a crisis of social reproduction that threatens the system's ability to sustain itself. Social reproduction includes all the activities necessary to maintain human life on a daily and generational basis. Not just biological reproduction, but cultural, emotional, and social reproduction as well. Under capitalism, much of this work has been relegated to families, particularly women within families, and performed without wages as a labor of love. But capitalism's drive to extract maximum surplus value from workers creates conditions that make social reproduction increasingly difficult. Longer working hours leave less time for childcare, household maintenance, and relationship building. Wage stagnation means that families need multiple incomes to survive, reducing the time available for unpaid care work. Geographic mobility for employment disrupts extended family networks that traditionally provided support for social reproduction. The result is that essential social reproductive work either doesn't get done, gets done under conditions of extreme stress and overwork, or gets commodified and purchased from low-wage service workers, often immigrant women and women of color, who then face their own social reproduction crises. This crisis creates opportunities for challenging the work-centered organization of society. When it becomes obvious that organizing life around paid employment is incompatible with sustaining human life and relationships, alternatives become not just desirable, but necessary for social survival. One of Weeks's most important insights is that the problems created by work-centered society cannot be solved through individual choices or lifestyle modifications. The structure of capitalist employment makes it impossible for individuals to opt out without facing severe material consequences, and individual solutions often just displace problems onto other people, particularly women and people of color, who end up doing the care work that privileged individuals refuse. The rhetoric of work-life balance exemplifies the limitations of individual solutions. The problem isn't that individuals haven't learned to balance work with other aspects of life. The problem is that the organization of society around capitalist employment makes such balance structurally impossible for most people. When work demands dominate temporal and spatial organization, balance becomes just another form of individual optimization rather than a challenge to the system. Similarly, the growing gig economy and entrepreneurship culture promise individual escape from traditional employment while actually extending work-like relations into every aspect of life. When everyone becomes their own personal brand and every activity becomes a potential source of income, the boundary between work and life disappears entirely. Weeks argues that meaningful alternatives to work-centered society require collective political action rather than individual lifestyle choices. This might include movements for universal basic income, maximum working hours, job guarantees, or universal access to social reproductive services like childcare, healthcare, and elder care. But she emphasizes that such policies must be understood as parts of a broader challenge to the ideology of work, rather than just reforms that make work more tolerable. The goal isn't to make wage labor more humane, but to reduce society's dependence on wage labor as the primary mechanism for distributing resources and organizing social life. Weeks argues that challenging work-centered society requires developing utopian imagination, the capacity to envision forms of social organization that don't exist yet, but that address the contradictions and limitations of current arrangements. This utopian dimension isn't about creating detailed blueprints for future society, but about expanding the sense of what's possible beyond current constraints. The utopian imagination necessary for post-work politics involves questioning assumptions that seem natural and inevitable under current conditions. What if survival didn't depend on employment? What if productive activity was organized around social need rather than private profit? What if care work was valued as highly as commodity production? What if time was organized around human flourishing rather than capital accumulation? These questions aren't merely theoretical. They point toward practical experiments that are already happening in various forms. Intentional communities, cooperatives, mutual aid networks, time banks, and other alternative economic arrangements offer glimpses of what post-work society might look like. But Weeks emphasizes that utopian imagination must be grounded in analysis of current conditions rather than abstract idealism. The alternatives that emerge from post-work politics must address the real needs and desires that the current system fails to meet, while building on the resources and capacities that already exist within current society. The utopian dimension also involves recognizing that people already engage in many activities that aren't structured like wage labor: friendship, artistic creation, volunteer work, parenting, community organizing. Post-work politics involves expanding and supporting these activities rather than subordinating them to employment requirements. One of Weeks's most sophisticated insights concerns how capitalism shapes not just material conditions, but the structure of desire itself. People don't just work because they need money. They work because they've been taught to desire the social recognition, personal identity, and sense of purpose that employment promises to provide. Challenging work-centered society requires understanding and transforming these desires as well as material structures. The ideology of work operates by channeling human needs for creativity, social connection, and meaningful activity into wage labor relations. Instead of meeting these needs directly through social arrangements that support human flourishing, capitalism promises that they can be met indirectly through employment that provides the money to purchase substitute satisfactions. This creates a peculiar form of alienation, where people seek through wage labor the very things that wage labor tends to destroy. You work long hours to earn money to pay for childcare, so you can work more hours. You work stressful jobs to afford stress relief activities. You work in isolation to earn money for social activities that you're too tired to enjoy. Weeks shows how challenging this dynamic requires not just different policies, but different ways of thinking about human needs and desires. Instead of accepting that creativity, social connection, and meaningful activity must be earned through employment, post-work politics insist that these are basic human needs that society should be organized to meet directly. This also means recognizing that many people's attachment to work comes from the absence of alternative sources of social recognition and meaningful activity. In a society where employment is the primary way people gain social status and personal identity, the refusal of work can feel like social death rather than liberation. So here's the truth that Kathi Weeks has spent her career articulating through rigorous theoretical analysis and political engagement. You don't work because work is natural, necessary, or inherently valuable. You work because you've been ideologically programmed to believe that your survival and worth as a human being depend on your willingness to sell your life to the highest bidder. The system doesn't just need your labor, it needs your belief that there's no alternative to organizing life around wage labor. But recognizing this isn't cause for despair, it's cause for hope. If the work ethic is ideologically constructed rather than naturally given, it can be challenged and transformed through collective action. If the current organization of society around paid employment is a recent historical development, it can be changed through political struggle. If people already engage in meaningful activities outside of wage relations, those activities can be expanded and supported through different social arrangements. The choice Weeks presents isn't between work and laziness, or between productivity and uselessness. It's between organizing society to serve capital accumulation and organizing society to serve human flourishing. It's between accepting that survival should depend on employment and insisting that survival is a right that shouldn't have to be earned. It's between subordinating life to work and subordinating work to life. This choice can't be made individually because the structures that compel work are social and political. Individual refusal without collective organization just leads to individual poverty. The transformation that Weeks envisions requires movements that can create alternative systems of meeting human needs alternative sources of social recognition and meaningful activity, alternative ways of organizing time and space. These movements are already emerging in various forms, from campaigns for universal basic income to experiments in cooperative economy, from demands for shorter working hours to the creation of mutual aid networks. They represent not just resistance to particular working conditions, but challenges to the fundamental assumption that work should dominate human life. Weeks offers no easy solutions because the transformation she envisions is profound and complex. It requires not just policy changes, but cultural transformation. Not just individual choices, but collective action. Not just resistance to current conditions, but creation of alternative arrangements. But the urgency of this transformation is becoming increasingly clear as the contradictions of work-centered society intensify. Climate change reveals the impossibility of infinite economic growth on a finite planet. Technological development threatens to eliminate many forms of employment while maintaining the requirement that people work to survive. The crisis of social reproduction makes it obvious that organizing life around paid employment is incompatible with sustaining human relationships and communities. The question isn't whether the current system is sustainable. It clearly isn't. The question is whether the transformation will be conscious and democratic or unconscious and chaotic, whether it will serve human needs or continue to serve capital accumulation, whether it will reduce human freedom or expand it. Your relationship to work, your assumptions about employment, productivity, and human worth is one of the most political aspects of your existence. Every day you choose whether to accept that survival should depend on employment or to work toward conditions where survival is unconditional. Every day you choose whether to measure human worth by productivity or to insist that human life has value independent of economic contribution. Stop working to survive. Start working toward a world where survival doesn't depend on work. The difference between these two orientations could determine the future of human freedom itself. The revolution doesn't require you to quit your job tomorrow. It requires you to stop believing that having a job is what makes you human. Your life is worth more than your labor. It's time to organize a society that recognizes this truth.